All right, Madam Clerk, I think we're ready for the next item.
Yes, item 48, presentation of preliminary financial results and closeout for the fiscal year ended June 30th, 2020.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Manager, I think you have an informational item for us tonight.
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you very much. I'm going to start off the presentation, but I will then be turning it over to Richard Stevenson and Michael Stewart, Maria Meredith, and Emily Hughes, all of the Department of Management and Finance. So the purpose of tonight's presentation is that it is a presentation, no action required. We're going to provide to you some preliminary information and on the financial results from fiscal 2020, and also recommendations about how to handle the CARES Act funds we've received and how to work our way through the current fiscal 21 situation. So, Richard, I think you're driving the slides here. If we could go to the next slide. Okay. Particularly like this slide because where we are, I'll just say we started in the upper left and we have gone through, you can see a picture there of the Earth wearing a mask. You can see a picture of a prototypical county employee with a hand on forehead. You can see a little bit of how sometimes when we look across, if we're ever in the district looking across at Roslyn, how it appears on a day of particularly high stress. And we're in the fourth month of our fiscal year. And typically at this point, we would be immersed in planning for coming to you next month for guidance and executing the current year, but thinking ahead as to what might be the approach for the budget presentation we would make in February. But we do not have that opportunity this year, given the pandemic. We've had an impact on our economy, our residents, jobs, housing, basic security, and we're in a very different point in time than we normally are. So what we're going to do is tonight, we once again are going to have to revisit our fiscal 21 budget and suggest some changes to that, as well as discuss the situation with schools and also maybe spend a minute or two focusing on fiscal 22. If we could go to the next slide. This is a slide that we presented last month that talked about the sources of our tax revenues and those that would be most affected by COVID-19 and the economic situation. The one thing that has changed since last month is not the pieces, not the slices of the pie and their percentages, but you can see on the left where it says early indications of residential real estate and vehicle personal property tax will be within budget estimates. In making the presentation in September, we spoke of the fact that one of our major payments, one of our major sources of revenue, the real estate tax payment, was due October 5th, and that we would have a better sense when we came to you at this board meeting about how we had done. And I'm happy to report that we're somewhere between 98 and 99% of all revenue that we had anticipated to be received, and we have met the estimates that were included in the budget. So that is good news. So the gap that we have explained has actually not expanded. It has stayed where it's at. And once again, some of the more sensitive sources of revenue continue to be affected, and we'll talk about those in a minute. So if we could go to the next slide. Those areas in the orange here, which are the parking meters, parks programs, fines and fees, still are where we thought they would be, still not performing very well. And the same estimates that we laid out for real estate taxes, and also our business taxes, our meals tax, hotels tax, and sales taxes. We estimated a shortfall originally when the fiscal 21 budget was proposed, if you remember, back in February, and then we revised that proposal in March. And those revisions in March were included in the adopted budget for fiscal 21 in April. And that fiscal year began July 1st. Since July 1st, there have been a number of changes, and we're back again with a re-estimate. And you can see here what that gap is. The total gap is between 42 and 60 million of an additional gap beyond what it was that was assumed when the county board adopted the budget in April for the fiscal year that started in July. And we've broken out that gap between the county and the schools. And you see numbers there laid out, the 27.9 million between and the 38.8 million for county and the 14 to 21 million dollars for schools. We go to the next slide. So how are we approaching this? The first priority, and it will continue to be my first priority in preparing budgets and revisions to budget, is to make sure we prioritize the health and safety of our residents. Our first focus in our response to COVID has been contact tracing, testing, and provision of PPE, and then supporting those most in need for eviction prevention and food, and also some housing assistance. We've spent somewhere in the vicinity of $9 to $10 million since the pandemic began on additional assistance that we had not anticipated at all needing towards eviction prevention and food, and we'll have more details on that in a bit. We've talked about how we could use federal funding, which currently the CARES Act funding, the Corona Relief Funds, are only available through December 30th. So we've focused on making sure that we spend every single dollar of the little bit over $41 million that we have received from the federal government to make sure it goes to our vulnerable residents, our businesses, and make sure that it's spent by the December 30th deadline. We're also spending some time focusing on some other options, which include steps we can take to slow down our hiring and creating capacity. And in a switch, this is actually one of the very rare times where it is actually a good idea to use some one-time funds to fill the gap. The pandemic will not go on forever, and to the extent that we can use one-time funds to bridge us from where we are now to where we think that the economy will be on better footing, it's more than appropriate to do. So in summary, if we go to the next slide, our preliminary recommendations on how to close the gap. Remember, the county revenue shortfall was between $28 and $39 million. We're trying to solve for the midpoint, which is a little bit between $33 and $34 million. There are 5 pieces that make up the proposed solution, which we're presenting tonight. The biggest piece of that is the closeout money. You can see on the bottom right, we'll have some more details that Richard will go through, but we're proposing of the funds that are available, close to $13.5 million be used to address the gap. The next biggest piece is the federal funding from the CARES Act of a little bit over $9 million, and Michael Stewart will walk through that. Then there are service reductions that have already taken place and personnel vacancies that are currently existing that we are going to propose to take out of the budget, which could save us $6 million. And then you see debt refinancing. We sent out a press release, I think it was yesterday or the day before, talking about how we had a bond sale and we had achieved the lowest rates on record. And we, on our new bonds, and we've refinanced virtually every one of the bonds in our portfolio for that savings. And then we have some adjustments. The adjustments there, and we'll go into a little bit more detail, are things like we're not driving our vehicles as much, so we have lower fuel costs and associated items like that. So all of those, when you add them up, come up between $33 and $34 million. I will now pass it over to Mr. Stevenson, or I think maybe perhaps it's Mr. Stewart. Yeah, I think it's Mr. Stewart.
All right. So I'm going to focus on a breakdown of our CARES spending. The county did receive an allocation of $41.3 million of the coronavirus relief fund allocation to the state. So I'm going to focus on CARES, but I also want to touch on some of the other grant sources we've received because CARES isn't the only story. So since March, the county has spent or obligated a little more than $30 million towards our COVID response efforts from the CARES allocation. The first and foremost, we've allocated a little over $10 million to help support APS and their efforts to roll out distance learning programs, as well as to make their facilities and transportation systems safer. Additionally, you heard earlier from Mr. Schwartz that the county is working on some wireless network deployment services for APS students around Randolph Elementary and Arlington Mill Elementary. We've also participated in expanding the wireless capabilities at the majority of APS school sites. Our CARES money has also been spent on various county technology projects. The biggest focus has been software and devices to support a dramatically expanded telework initiative so that the majority of county employees can now be fully functional from home. But we've also spent technology dollars on other software services like telehealth for DHS so that they can serve their clients remotely. And then finally, we've made an investment in our courtrooms to enable the courts to provide virtual hearings for a lot of their trials. Because the courtrooms are generally or often too small to host all of the people that they need to host. So in addition to that, we've spent about $5 million on staffing costs to date, and that includes a lot of staff associated with our Emergency Operations Center, so public health, public safety staff who were directly supporting this event going back to March. We've spent $1.3 million of CARES money on PPE, and this is where I'm going to start jumping into some of the other grants. We also have, we've submitted about $4.8 million to date to FEMA for reimbursement. And so you can see our PPE costs have been almost equally shared between, in this case, FEMA and CARES. Testing and contact tracing. To date, we've spent a total of about $800,000. Again, that's split between FEMA and CARES. That number is actually starting to grow on a monthly basis as our testing operations are expanding, but also as some of the other sources of funds at the state level are starting to dry up. Quarantine isolation housing. This is primarily the county's operation at the Highlander, where we've housed at-risk, homeless, and congregate care clients who didn't have the ability to isolate. FEMA has picked up the majority of those costs to date. CARES will be picking up the majority of those costs till the end of the calendar year. Eviction prevention and housing assistance. Again, Mr. Schwartz mentioned our spending in this area. To date, we've spent about $7 million total from CARES and a number of other grant sources at the federal level. A lot of special HUD money flowed down to the county, and then another $1.5 million on food. Small business grant program you're very familiar with. We allocated $1.6 million of our CARES money to that. County Services Health and Safety is a bit of a catch-all for public health related work. This includes improvements to county facilities to make them safer. So things like plexiglass installations, social distance signage, as well as special cleaning services to make sure that they're getting a enhanced level of cleaning over what we traditionally do. There's also some of DHS's partner client service providers had incremental costs increase associated with their COVID responses. So in some cases, our contract costs increased a bit to help them offset those costs. And then finally, this includes some of our contracted staff support for the Emergency Operations Center. Finally, FEMA, that's right, FEMA local match. The county has to match 25% of our FEMA eligible costs. And thankfully, the Treasury Department has said we can use our CARES allocation to cover that cost that would normally be borne by the general fund. Right, next slide. All right, so looking forward, we have a little over $11 million of our CARES allocation that is not directly obligated at this point. So you'll see a number of the same categories from the previous slide: PPE, testing, tracing, the quarantine housing, small business work support, and county services, health and safety. It's more of the same you saw before. We just have another few months to get us to the end of the fiscal year, so we're intending to cover those costs. But the biggest number here is obviously the public health and public safety staffing costs. And so this is a clarification that was offered by the Treasury Department last month, which there's always been an allowance within the Treasury Department guidance that we can use our CARES funding to pay for public health and public safety staff costs, is so long as those staffing roles have been substantially dedicated to COVID response or substantially redirected in order to provide COVID response. It was I'll just say the guidance for many months was ambiguous as to whether they really meant what they said, but they did provide clarification in September that made the county confident that we can use the funds to support predominantly our public health, our locally funded public health staff, who have obviously been doing almost nothing but COVID response work since March. So we're going to, our plan would be to allocate a substantial amount of the funding towards that use.
All right.
And that is all I have.
Okay, so I'll take over from here. Thank you, Michael.
Yep.
Just want to summarize a little bit of on the school side. So in addition to the support, as you know, as a result of the pandemic, the county is providing the schools for the end of 20 and 21 above the revenue sharing of local taxes prescribed in the principles of revenue sharing. Some additional funding are going to school in support of schools. And so the first bucket here is some debt and reserve savings. And just like the manager mentioned how we refinanced county debt, we also refinance school debt, which results in 1.9 million in savings for them. And this will continue saving them some money in the future years. In addition, the schools, they share in the contribution to the general operating reserve. And this year, with the FY21 adopted budget being a little bit lower than the FY20 budget, the reserve level is slightly above the minimum requirements necessary. And so the manager in closeout is proposing refunding a small amount to help schools offset their needs in FY21. And the next two buckets we've talked about. Michael pointed out the 10 million in county CARES funding to schools. This is in addition to the 4.7 million in direct CARES funding that they receive from the state, and about $2 million in federal funding that they received. And of course, heard multiple times about the wireless, in-kind wireless contribution the county is making that will benefit APS. And so in addition to the direct financial support to our schools, you know, the county also provides over $12 million in services, which impacts schools and children. The support ranges from youth programming to DHS services to school crossing guards and resource officers. Now, it's hard not to look ahead. The manager mentioned this, and usually, as he said, at this point in the fiscal year, we have a pretty good idea of the direction of next year's revenue and expenses. This year, things are a little more uncertain. And as we highlighted again last month, there were some significant tax revenue sources, which we're trying to determine how they'll recover over the next 9 months of this fiscal year and then into fiscal year 22. And so some of the areas of concerns or areas we're closely watching are obviously we anticipate continued costs in response to COVID and with the continued slow economic recovery. This coming January, assessments will be coming out, and we'll see how valuations are affected, particularly in commercial real estate, with potentially higher vacancy rates or pressures on rent rates. What the impacts will be to business operations that affect our business tangible and business license taxes. And as we've all seen, the fiscal impacts of lower tourism and business activity, they've clearly affected our sales taxes, meals taxes, car rental, and hotel taxes. And again, we're still seeing a slow return to normalcy for a number of the non-tax revenue that the manager mentioned earlier, and then additional cost pressures that we'll have to take into consideration as we start to formulate the proposed budget for FY22. So now let's talk a little bit about FY20 and how we finished the fiscal year. So after carrying over reserves and other restricted funding, there is approximately $22.4 million available for other uses. This is a slight decrease from last year's amount, which was just over 23 million. And on the slide here, the pie chart illustrates the county manager's recommended allocations of that available unrestricted funding. And they cover 4 areas. As you can see, more than half, nearly 60% of the available funding, 13.4 million, is being recommended for the 21 revenue shortfall and the current budget gap the county has due to the pandemic. Next, the county manager is recommending that 5 million be set aside to fund anticipated costs in 22 that will need to address COVID-related impacts on health and safety. Third, there's $2 million being recommended to create an employee separation contingent, as we're calling it. As we work through the development of the 22 budget, we'll be considering changes in how we deliver services based on COVID and, and due to what other anticipated revenue declines there may be. And this contingent would allow the manager some flexibility in addressing those, the impacts of those changes. And for example, a couple years ago or in prior years, we've offered various incentives for early retirement or other buyout options. And, it's likely this would take effect before the beginning of FY22, and so the funding would be needed in 21 to potentially pay some of those costs. And lastly, as we've done for many years, funding for an operating contingent to address unforeseen needs that arise during the fiscal year, such as unexpected contractual needs or special projects or planning efforts that aren't in the base budget. So overall, the county ended the fiscal year within budget. In total, we ended the year with 242 million in fund balance. However, about 91% of this is restricted, which I'll talk about in a minute. And as I showed you on the previous slide, 22.4 million or 2.4% is available for allocation to discretionary uses. And this is similar to prior years. We had a small percentage of funding available from spending below budget. This year, however, tax revenues were right at budget. I'll show that on a slide in a moment. And non-tax revenues, including fees and fines and charges for services, were slightly under budget. We saw significant drop off of fee-based revenue impacted by the shutdown. And then on the expense side, where we had some savings in healthcare. We actually had personnel savings due to open vacancies in a tight labor market, which was pre-COVID. And then once COVID hit and a hiring freeze was put in place on many of those positions, as the pandemic began. So departmental savings can vary from year to year. And these savings, are contributing to the year-end fund balance. And they, in the departments, can be influenced by, a number of factors. We could have, in any given year, a bad weather event that, environmental services may overspend their budget, due to, snow removal, their staff vacancies or changes that are made to the original plan. Departments holding positions for a variety of reasons. More recently, in anticipation of cuts coming up as we prepare for the following fiscal year. But for the last 5 years, county operating savings have ranged from just under 1% to 2.5%. It's also important to note that the savings don't necessarily occur in the same departments or programs every year. It can vary from year to year. And in fiscal year 20, the departments ended the year with about $15.5 million in savings of their operating budgets after you adjust for unspent grant funds. So as I mentioned, the little quick summary of year-end tax revenues were right at budget. Real estate came in above budget, 1.7% higher. However, that was offset by drops, especially in the last few months of the fiscal year, to sales, meals, and transient occupancy tax, which are hotel taxes. And so in the end, actual revenue to budget was within like $50,000 of each other. So fund balance, as I said, was totals 242. 91% of fund balance is restricted or already allocated, based on board policy or prior board action. Of the 219 million in restricted funds reserves, totaling almost $100 million, are carried over to the next fiscal year. School expenditure savings and changes to tax revenues are shared with the schools per the revenue principles of revenue sharing. Any unspent affordable housing and investment fund monies are carried over to the program in the next fiscal year. We also have restricted funds such as grants or seized assets, which are required to be carried over for the purposes that they were received. And then finally, we anticipated funds from FY20, which the manager identified last spring as the budget was being adopted. And that funding the board has already assumed and included in the FY21 adopted budget. So that's the last bullet on this slide. And with that, I'll turn it over to Maria to talk quickly about reserves.
Thanks. As Mr. Stevenson mentioned, our reserve levels make up a significant portion of our fund balance at $89.6 million. Three reserves make up that amount. The general fund operating reserve at $74 million, our self-insurance reserve at $5 million, and our most flexible reserve, the stabilization reserve, will be at $10.6 million. We did use $4 million of our stabilization reserve to balance the 21 budget in April. And the bond rating agencies, particularly Moody's, has in the past shown some concern that our reserve levels should be at a higher percentage. And while we've made steady progress in increasing our reserves these past few years, you can see from this slide that our reserve levels are still lower than most of our AAA peers. So as you are all aware, our reserves are really important to maintaining our AAA ratings, and I'm glad that we've made the progress that we've made. Back to you, Richard, for the last slide.
Okay, so the last slide, just run quickly through some of the next steps. As we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this is an advertisement. The board won't take any action until November on the recommendations that the manager is making. When we come back to you in November, we will also give you present a more specific forecast for FY22, and hopefully getting some guidance from the board for the manager developing the FY22 budget. And then, of course, in the February-March timeframe, we have the county manager will be proposing the budget. Now, when we come back in November, there may be some slight changes to numbers in the presentation. The county's comprehensive annual financial report will not be available until then, and we will at that time highlight what any of those last changes may be due to final audit decisions. So with that, I will turn it back over to the manager or chair.
Okay, good. Thank you, Richard. I would just say, just to wrap up, normally when we're making our presentation on closeout, there's a lot of numbers and a lot of details, but we're only talking about one piece of the budget. This year, obviously, very different. We're trying to integrate both all of the information about closeout, the information about the federal funding from CARES Act, the needs for Arlington Public Schools, and also a look ahead to fiscal 22, and then the expenditures that we have. So a lot of information there. I know it can be very confusing in a lot of different pieces, But with that, we conclude the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. Appreciate it. You know, just for fun, Mr. Schwartz, how many budgets do you think you've done?
I stopped counting at some point. I've done about 28 in my professional career.
Yeah, okay, I'm close to that. And I don't know about you, but I've never seen a budget go like this one. Just letting Mr. Carantonis know in case you think this is usual, and I know you don't. Thank you very much. These are interesting times. Appreciate you kind of guiding us through this, and it's good to have this information to prepare us for November. Colleagues, questions? Any questions or comments for the manager or staff? Mr. DeFranti.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a request to advertise, so my comments will be brief, hopefully one more sentence. Thank you for the most in need piece of, I think it's important for the community to know that we have been focusing on safety and hunger and housing. And then I suspect over the next month, we'll have there'll be community input and a conversation about the one-time funds part at the beginning of the presentation. And so I do think that this may be a Keynes type moment where some spending now can help us later. And you've already started on that, while also noting that fiscal year 22 is likely to be difficult. And then last, I'll just say that on the state and federal COVID support table, thank you. I think we had a second column, and perhaps over the next month, we might be able to build out the local money that we've been doing as a third column to that. So those are my comments. Thanks for the thorough presentation.
Thank you. Colleagues, anybody else? Getting a little late. Mr. Carantonis.
I want to echo Mr. DeFrantis' thanks for all the work that is in that. I perfectly realize how non-normal this year and how challenging this year is. I also think that's also a great opportunity to think about, really structuring priorities, etc. I wanted to ask you one thing. So how do you expect to collect public input on the priorities and the way that the proposal is structured right now? And I also want to, you mentioned, Mr. Manager, last time in October that one major event will be the election in November, which will, greatly inform also what kind of other federal help, etc., we may be realistically looking forward to. So I just want to know what will happen. What is the kind of outreach we are planning to deploy so that we get input on the priorities as they're presented right now?
Right. I'm going to refer that question over to Maria and Richard, because I know they've been working with the CAPE team to come up with ways to get input.
I'll start, and Maria can add on. So we'll have some of the standard vehicles of access to the website, continued conversation, fiscal affairs tomorrow, Thursday, some of those typical avenues, and we are working with Bryna and her team to see what other opportunities are available over the next several weeks to effectively and efficiently gather some of that input that the residents may have on the manager's proposal.
And of course, there's public comment at the next board meeting as well.
Yeah, so we will usually, what we've done in the past is we've opened up either a place on the website, which, by the way, it's still not operational, but hopefully will be by the morning for that. And then also an email address, which is on the DMF website for people to send in comments. So that would be our approach to that. I have a sneaking suspicion you asked another question too.
Oh, I have a ton, but it's a request for advertisement. We can start talking about small business support forever, but that's not for now.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. And then, of course, Mr. Carantones, we've got open door Mondays. We were accessible by email and all of those usual. I will be very surprised if we don't hear from folks.
Actually, we have to invite them to weigh in and to tell us really what their early this time, what their priorities are, based on the multiple challenges that this economy is posing us. So that's important.
Yeah, thank you. Although I think Mr. DeFerranti kind of, really outlined it well. It's health and welfare top priority, and then it gets a little bit tougher maybe. Ms. Crystal.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thank you all for the extraordinary presentation. I think I've heard Mr. Stevenson say that this is one of the toughest times of the year because you're living in 3 budgets at once, and that is certainly the case when those budgets have required significant revision because of a global pandemic and associated economic collapse. So just one question to sort of surface, obviously no action tonight, but one of the things I've been really struggling with is, the goal, I would say my goal anyway, and I think it's reflected largely in these priorities of carrying over as much of this balance as we possibly can to fiscal 22. I think more uncertainty lies ahead, and any amount of one-time funding will be especially helpful. So can you help me understand a little bit the proposal here to move $2 million, not to carry over, to kind of have at our disposal to solve some thorny workforce challenges, frankly, of trying to keep everybody on board if we can. Why not carry that all over? Why allocate that now? I know some of the strategies you're hoping to deploy to see if we can't prevent filled positions from being eliminated, but why couldn't those strategies take effect when in July of next year, when the fiscal 22 budget, which we'll then deliberate on next spring, starts?
Yeah. So thank you for that question. I think that the choices we face right now are difficult, and so one of the things we are considering, we have not finally settled on, and we've done this about 3 times in the last 8 years, would be to offer employees who, and there's a code provision that the board passed a few years ago that allows us to offer retirement benefits, full retirement or retirement benefits for individuals. It's something called the Rule of 80, where you add in the number of years of service plus your age. If you equal 80, then you're eligible for whatever that full benefit is. We're able to offer that benefit to people who meet a rule of 78. The impact of that is a little bit, a draw on the retirement fund, but what it also does is that it requires us to pay out full balances that people have for leave that they've accrued throughout their career. And sometimes those are significant costs that can hit a budget in an unanticipated way if we are expediting a number of people leaving the workforce. So that could actually happen in the current fiscal year. And so that is one of the purposes for having those funds available. It is really our hope and expectation that we won't have to spend all of that, and that we'll yet again carry some of it over to fiscal 22.
And if employees, God willing, we're not going to get there, right? I know this is none of our intention, because we want to keep this ship afloat, right, for the time when the pandemic ends. But if filled positions do need to be terminated in the fiscal 22 budget, do we pay out the benefits for those, or the unused leave time for those employees as well?
Yeah, we would do that. And then, so the theory behind that is that as those people leave those positions, we leave them vacant long enough so that we accrue savings that could essentially be deemed as paying for those payouts, but we need the money up front. And then when we end up refilling those positions, traditionally what happens is they tend to be filled with people who are more junior, so the salaries and benefits associated with those positions are a little less costly. That's another way of recovering some additional savings.
Oh, that's interesting. So we could use this $2 million and carry over to create potentially the retirement incentive option, but then hopefully realize that $2 million during fiscal 22.
That's correct.
Okay, that's helpful for me. Thank you.
Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you. similar to Ms. Crystal's line of conversation. So I just wanted to alert members of our community to, something that's a little bit different this year. We typically, reserve carrying over all of prior fiscal year's balances to a future fiscal year, and it funds key priorities, which for the board has primarily come in the form of our Affordable Housing Investment Fund contributions. And this year does not present that opportunity if we adopt the manager's proposal moving forward. So I don't say that to make anyone's hair on fire, but just to really highlight the circumstances that we're in, that as we consider the fiscal 22 budget, those will absolutely have to come and be balanced with the entirety of the budget program that we have to consider. And since so much more is unknown at this point than is known, it's just something that people should be mindful of. It's going to be different.
If
Yes, Mr. Schwartz.
I think that's actually, I appreciate Mr. Dorsey bringing it up because that's a very important point. We have online a 30-page budget report, which I'm holding up here, but it would be challenging to even the most trained eyes to go through here and figure out what is happening with our balances in the Affordable Housing Investment Fund. So let me speak to that directly. We will have enough money in the fiscal 21 AHIF fund to meet all our current obligations and anticipated anything that's in the pipeline. And in addition, we have, as part of the Metropolitan Park community benefit, we are going to be receiving a payment of $20 million from Amazon. That is not, I don't say that to diminish the fact that traditionally we have kept a fair size of our carryover balance and invested in AHIF in the next year. And that will be something that we will be really challenged to do. I don't think we're going to be able to do it at the same level. So people should be aware of that. I also would note that one of the reasons why we will not have those kinds of balances is that we've never before been faced with having to pay out funds for eviction prevention and other kinds of housing and additional rental assistance. That's not to diminish the fact that we always want to invest additional funds in future housing opportunities, but here we have to make choices. And I would encourage people as they work through the equations in their head, realize that the first priority has to come to spending some of those dollars towards eviction prevention and food assistance and those types of things.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Karantonis.
Just as a comment to Mr. Dorsey's and Mr. Schwartz's comments, I believe that, yes, it's very well understood that right now eviction prevention is absolutely an absolute priority. However, eviction prevention, and it keeps our neighbors in their homes, which is extremely important. However, AHIF funding is also investment funding that in a downturn, these brick and mortar investments are something that still creates value, creates wealth, and even creates jobs, etc. So I am satisfied at this point by the statement that we are meeting our pipeline. So we will be able to fund our pipeline, and it's a lucky coincidence that we get that extra, that we have that extra cushion of money that we get through the Amazon contribution from last year. So that's an important piece of that. However, I am really on the point where I distinguish the two types of housing expenditures between something that is a transfer to keep people in their homes and it will be completely consumed, and something that is an investment and creates returns on the long term. And right now it's really, interest rates are really rock bottom right now. This is a good moment to invest for some, investors in housing, nonprofit investors included.
All right. I think the thing I'm thinking about is how closeout, usually we have a pot of money, correct me, Mr. Manager, if I'm wrong, but I think and we decide how we're sort of allocated. I don't remember ever having to worry about not balancing the budget and needing to put a chunk of it into just balancing the budget for that year. I think that's very new, and I think it's important that we kind of people, you know, you're used to hearing about budgets on the federal level, and sometimes you forget we can't run a deficit, any deficit. So that's one of our challenges, and we don't have a choice on that one. All right. I think we're maybe ready to move on to the next item. Thank you very much. Thanks for all of the work. Crazy budget times. Thank you very much.